Welcome back. This is part 2 of the presentation on recruitment, or more correctly, maintaining or increasing the strength of the ADF. There are two myths with regards to recruitment for the ADF. In part 1 of this presentation, I looked at retentions and separations. This part is looking at whether there is actually a recruitment crisis. However, I am not just going to look at whether the ADF is able to obtain enough recruits. I am also going to look at the impact of the system upon the recruits themselves and the impact of this system upon Australian strategic resilience. In the first part of this deep dive into recruitment, I noted that the Defence Department and the ADF effectively had a communication strategy on how difficult it is to find Australians willing to serve. This communication was backed up by the results of this rather scary survey. Let's dismiss the survey straight away. The number of Australians willing to serve, in percentage terms, was probably close to what the numbers looked like at the start of the Second World War. After all, when Stalin and Hitler effectively became allies just prior to their attack on and subsequent partition of Poland in 1939, opposition to involvement in the war came from both the right and the left. At the same time, Australians back then in that 18 to 24-year-old age bracket had all seen the cost of war, from the families who had lost loved ones and the very real presence of veterans who were severely disabled by wounds and gas. Despite this, Australia once again was able to create an all-volunteer force that would serve in both Europe and the Pacific. The article discussing this survey also refers to Ukraine to show how badly Australians look like in comparison. But the results between the two countries are actually quite similar. 10% of eligible Ukrainian males have actually fled the country. Only about a third of the remaining eligible males are willing to serve voluntarily. These figures are even more surprising when you consider that these men are literally experiencing violent attacks against their fellow civilians and are well aware that a Russian victory will radically change who and how their government is run, and that the best example for what will happen is the brutal regime next door to them in Belarus. Simple surveys don't explain everything. Meanwhile, the argument here in Australia is that we need to provide higher pay and better conditions so that we can get the recruits we need. Alternatively, we could argue that what we are failing to explain is what it is about liberal democracy that is worth defending, not just here in Australia, but also those of Japan, South Korea, Taiwan and the Philippines. However, I don't believe either our political leadership or even defence are even trying. Rather than lead a debate about values, they fall back upon the traditional question and ask, how much do we have to pay you to get you to enlist? Let me say straight up that ADF members deserve good wages, conditions and career prospects. However, we are not asking the question whether the current ADF model is the best model for them to have good wages, conditions and career prospects. Is there a better model, even if it costs more than what we have now? What I can say that what we currently have is very much a reflection of the APS, the Australian Public Service staff model, and bluntly, it doesn't work even there. However, in terms of management, it is significantly easier to run. There are questions that I am not going to cover in this presentation, let alone be really able to answer, because only Defence has the resources to do so. However, I am going to address some in my recommendations. Examples of these questions include, why should the ADF have a maximum of 3 pay increments when ADF members will run into career choke points that, no matter how competent they are, will take 5 to 7 years before they have another chance at promotion? Is it better to acknowledge and manage higher turnover amongst junior ranks? Should we accept service without a career is beneficial for both recruits and Australia? Shouldn't we not only prepare them for a civilian career, but also offer some form of hybrid that doesn't completely lose them to service? Should pays be the same between the branches? should rank equivalents have the same pay? As an example, the roles of colonel equivalents can be vastly different between the branches. Equally, also as an example, should a 1-star sitting comfortably in Canberra get the same pay as one actually in command of a major formation? Despite these questions, the first one that I can really ask is whether there are enough Australians actually willing to enlist. In the rest of this presentation, I believe that I can show you that there are, in fact, enough Australians willing to stand up and volunteer. This then follows on with the question as to why, despite that, the ADF is experiencing what they call a recruitment crisis. This chart here is, or this graph, is a rather interesting examination of the number of Australians willing to serve in the ADF and the factors stopping them. I've provided a link to the article from which it is drawn in the overview, and it's based on ADF sources. Please note that I am trying to keep complex charts like this to a minimum, but sometimes there is no choice, especially as this chart is the basis of the next section on recruitment numbers by year, so I do have to go into a little detail. There are a few takeaways. Firstly, the estimated pool of 17 to 24-year-olds inclined to join the ADF is put at about 445,000. I would note that the number of Australians willing to serve now is about the same as those who actually volunteered to serve in the first 2 years of the Second World War. But, of course, Australia's population back then was only a third of what it is now. The higher percentage back then that actually wound up serving, despite strong domestic opposition, shows attitudes do change in a time of crisis, so those willing to serve may increase. Equally, enlistment standards were quickly lowered in the Second World War. Minimum height was actually reduced to 5 feet, or about 150 centimetres, and the upper age increased to 40. So remember that this chart only tells us how many are ineligible under current enlistment standards, but does not show how many of them would be willing to serve with a more liberal criteria. Nevertheless, the ratio of eligible Australian males that are inclined to join compared to those not inclined is nearly 50%. All things considered, that's actually a pretty good ratio and not far off what we were seeing in Ukraine. What makes the figures look worse is the dreadful number of women inclined to join. Combined, the ratio actually drops to 1 in 3. This actually highlights two problems. Firstly, why are Australian women so unwilling to defend a way of life that has proven to be the most progressive for women anywhere in the world? Secondly, is the attempt to increase the ratio of women in the ADF actually forcing down the numbers that can be recruited? I can't answer either questions from here, but I would suggest that someone should be trying. The next question is how many from the eligible pool not inclined to join would change their mind about volunteering should Australia face a direct threat. It's simply not known. Using the Ukrainian example of 60% willing to enlist, the total pool would then increase, even if it is just from the eligible pool, to around the 750,000 mark. However, for a lot of reasons, I personally doubt Australia would reach this percentage even in a crisis. Hopefully, we will never find out. I am going to bang on a bit here over these numbers, so if you like you can skip ahead. That's because I do struggle with some of the figures even in this chart, simply because I believe it overstates the reasons for making Australians ineligible. As an example, it gives the obesity rate for all Australians as 20%. This is a little over double the actual obesity rate for children leaving high school. So this figure is only achieved by including overweight people into the obese category. Note that many countries are now offering forms of pre-enlistment courses to get applicants up to physical and educational standards. There are some complaints that the failure rate for these courses, for example in America, is close to 20%. An alternative way to look at it is that America is getting in 4 out of every 5 applicants who were previously ineligible actually into their armed forces. If that option was available in Australia, then at that rate, you would increase the potential recruitment pool by around 200,000, and it might actually be good for them. The 13% disability rate also seems high. The risk of disability increases dramatically as you age. As the national average is just under 20%, you would expect it significantly lower in this age group. Note also that the 20% rate includes those with mental disabilities, but this chart has a separate section for psych ineligibility. A more realistic assessment would add a minimum of another 100,000 to the eligible pool. Equally, this chart rules out a little over 8% because of psychological illness. This again seems quite high. The best figures I could find is that the number of Australians who will suffer some form of psychosis in their lifetime is estimated at 3 to 4%, with an unknown portion of these diseases appearing later in life. Schizophrenia, the most common form of severe psychosis, and one that hits early in the very young, affects about 1% of Australians in this age group. Schizophrenia also accounts for half of all forms of severe psychosis. So based on available stats, severe mental illness would rule out between 17,000 to a maximum of 68,000. Yet this chart lists 147,000 as ineligible due to mental illness. As I will discuss later, seeing a school counsellor is actually grounds for rejection on mental health reasons for an applicant to the ADF. That's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, and if anything, shows why ADF members still need to conceal mental health problems to prevent damage to their career, or even worse. Still, having a more realistic standard for mental health problems would increase the potential recruit pool by around 100,000. So we could be looking at a potential recruit pool increase of 400,000. So what does this all mean? Well, for a change, I'm going to try and make it easier. Each year there are about 300,000 Australians turning 18. It doesn't matter what age they subsequently enlist at, whether it be 18 or 24, that is the number of Australians added to the potential mobilisation pool. Based on the previous data, I've broken it up into two categories, eligible and ineligible. The third column is those who have passed every enlistment standard, current enlistment standard, and are also considering enlistment. The first grouping uses the stats from the article, while the second and third sections are based on my previous comments about the chart overstating the obese, disabled and mental health categories. You can see some of my concerns beyond my comments on these categories almost immediately. The inclined to join ratio overall was given about 1 out of every 3 Australians, which means the potential mobilisation pool would only see about 100,000 new faces inclined to join every year. And you only reach this figure by including every single Australian entering the mobilisation pool. Equally, just because they are inclined to apply doesn't mean they will. So based on these figures, to get 64,000 applications in 2024, let alone 80,000 in 2022, is almost impossible. Either the presumptions behind this chart are wrong, or the figures provided by Defence are wrong, or there are structural problems in the Australian economy which is affecting young people. My bet is on Defence, but it's probably a bit of all three. Regardless that, on face value, the data for Australians inclined to join is far too low. It's all I have to use, so that's what I'll be using for the following sections. Which means, using their stats, the minimum number of Australians added to the recruitment pool that are both inclined to join and eligible is about 47,000. Graphically, from here on, every solid figure will represent 1,000 actual or proposed recruits. Every clear figure represents an additional 1,000 potential recruits who are inclined to join and will pass every enlistment standard. The ones with question marks represent the same, but only using the expanded criteria. To maintain an ADF of 60,000, which is its theoretical current strength, but with an average separation rate of 10.5%, it needs to recruit a minimum of 7,000 Australians every year. So this is what it looks like to maintain the ADF from that pool of 47,000 per year. Note that we had 64,000 applicants, of course, and it is impossible for me to say how many of them actually fulfilled the enlistment criteria. However, Despite the numbers, the ADF failed to even achieve this intake, and this is what it actually looks like. Interestingly, while both the Navy and Air Force increased in strength, the Army continued its decline despite the retention bonuses. Bluntly, there is absolutely no recruitment problem. It's simply not debatable. Remember that this is the intake for all three branches, yet for every one accepted as a recruit, there is more than 6 who are turned away, with too many permanently lost to the ADF. Obviously, it is a little more complicated than I can cover in this presentation by factors such as personal preference. Equally, in a so-called recruitment crisis, it is a job of recruitment to find a pathway into service for an applicant, not find a way to bounce them. So, by any measure, there are more than enough applicants. Certainly, the ADF should not have any problem maintaining the required intake of 7,000 per year. But now I'll make it more interesting. The ADF has a target strength of around 80,000 by 2040, but at the moment it is not even close to getting there. This is why the ADF has a recruitment target of 10,000 per year. It needs 10,000 firstly to cover separations, then to replace the Army, the strength that has been lost in the Army, and finally to increase its strength by roughly 1,500 per year that it needs to achieve its 2040 target. And this is what it looks like. So let's now make it even more interesting. In my presentation on preparing for a strategy of attrition, I recommended creating a reserve army by training 1 combined arms brigade plus supporting units per year. The number of recruits needed each year was about 4,000. In order to both increase the professional ADF to 80,000 by 2040 and create a reserve army, the number of recruits needed from the applicants in 2024 now looks like this. And it is, to my mind, remarkably achievable. In my book, I actually recommended the equivalent of a combined arms division plus supporting units being trained every year for the reserve army. I actually scaled it down for these presentations because from the press and ADF comments, I thought we'd struggle to achieve it. However, now that actual numbers are available, this is what it would look like to recruit an additional 20,000 into a reserve army per year and increase the strength of the ADF to 80,000 by 2040. It would obviously be a challenge based on the available data, but as I said, that data probably overstates a number of Australians who are ineligible. If we actually introduce pre-recruitment courses to get Australians up to the standard required, then the actual rate for successful applicants is about what the American Army is achieving right now. Equally, the concept of a reserve army that only requires a single year's full-time service may increase the number of eligible Australians inclined to join. However, simply because Defence is absolutely committed to the existing ADF model, to my knowledge, no one has tried to find out how the numbers would change under different forms of enlistment or models for an ADF model, whether it be my reserve army concept or whatever concept you wish to propose. We're simply just not looking. It's pretty obvious that there is no recruitment crisis. The question is, how do we get young Australians willing to serve but who haven't made that mind up from here to there? To me, that means 2 things: getting the application process right and sign-up bonuses. Our current recruitment process is fairly weird and getting even weirder, if not even more difficult than it should be. There is a fairly standard theme in the media that the ADF tries to find a way to reject applications. Anecdotally, there are plenty of problems that Australians face when trying to enlist. I've provided a link to an article by ASPI that talks about the problems experienced by an applicant absolutely determined to get into the Army. Firstly, the young man, Oliver, had to wait a year for his application to be processed, and he was lucky. At the time, the average application took 300 days, so statistically, there were many that took well over the year it took him. Staff turnover in recruitment was so high that he had to deal with 4 different recruiters. That's a different recruiter every 3 months. Documents were lost due to poor record keeping. It took 6 months to obtain medical clearance, and this included travelling to a medical exam only to find out his recruiter had forgotten to book him in. Note that Oliver's story is not unique. Others are routinely discussed in the media, and some have even made it into Hansard via a Senate estimates hearing. Many years ago, I personally knew of one applicant from New South Wales who was told he would have to wait well over a year before his application would be processed. He went to the Northern Territory where he was able to enlist almost immediately. How these quotas work is absolutely mind-boggling. It's actually almost impossible to assess the problems Australians have when applying to join the ADF. Yes, we have anecdotal evidence, but we have no hard data whatsoever. Defence has not looked and is still not looking. Yet what is clear from the available historical evidence is that the Army can actually obtain enough recruits to at least maintain its strength, while the RAAF and Royal Australian Navy could steadily increase theirs. What is absolutely fascinating in looking at recruitment is what happened in the midst of the economic impact of the COVID epidemic. Firstly, young Australians sought financial security through enlistment. Therefore, the number of applications went through the roof. Secondly, the government told the Army to substantially increase its intake to soak up some unemployed. This directive was also applied to the APS, though obviously in much larger numbers. Under this direction, the Army would manage a 25% increase in its intake for 2021 to well above the 3,600 it needed to maintain its strength. That intake would drop dramatically in the years that followed, despite applications staying well above 60,000 per year. The question then becomes, what was happening after COVID? Far less important to the drop in the ADF intake, but very important to its leadership, was that the increase in the number of applications caused a blowout in the average wait time. The average wait time is found by measuring the days between an application being received to when the applicant is actually recruited into the ADF, or the application is rejected, or the application is withdrawn. If there is an increase in the number of applications without a comparable increase in the ADF intake, then the average wait time will increase. Alternatively, if there is a decrease in the ADF intake, the average wait time will also increase. Regardless of what was causing the blowout, the increase in the average wait time created a serious problem for ADF management, and that was very negative exposure in Senate estimates. There they faced heated attacks over why applicants had to wait for a year or longer before they could complete their enlistment. Now, were these attacks fair? The reality is that the average, and I will stress that it is the average, time taken to process an application was over 300 days, or about 10 months in 2022. The recruitment contract was subsequently awarded to ADECO at $1.4 billion for 6 years starting at the end of 2022. This would have actually put it, if it was an acquisition, in the top 30. Now, before I go on, I'm not recommending either Manpower or ADECO over each other. I intend to show that fundamentally, ADF management engaged them for 2 very different outcomes. However, the new ADECO contract represented an increase of nearly $140 million per year, more than double that of the previous contract, and that should raise alarm bells in its own right. We're talking nearly $3 million a week to process the same number of applicants. In ADECO's first year, the average wait time actually blew out to 350 days. But in fairness to ADECO, the sheer number of applications it had to get through made it look much worse than it truly was. It takes time to get through the backlog and process more than 60,000 new applications, which alone amounts to an extra 250 every single working day. So you would expect the wait time to increase before it started to decline. However, I would suggest that the blowout to 350 days, average days, was far higher than expected. Again, Defence hasn't released any real data, so it's hard to say for sure. In fairness, the time taken to process an application has now declined to just over 250 days. That's still 8 months. Equally, and I really want to emphasise this, the rapid decline from an average wait time in 1 year highlights a very serious problem that actually benefits Defence management, but at a tremendous cost to Australia. I'll explain that cost a little later. In reality, like the drop in separation rates, the supposed drop in wait times is another bit of statistical magic. Let me explain. This is a summary of the KPIs for the $1.4 billion contract awarded to Adecco. It was provided to set an estimates in 2024 by Major General Studhart. It's a wonderful example of off-the-cuff jargon. It really is. He was to say, the 3 major key performance indicators for this contract are the volume of target achievement, the velocity by which we can take an application and then issue a letter of offer to a candidate, and thirdly, the timeliness and quality of the deliverables we receive from Adecco to ensure we are seeing the business intelligence of their system. It's marvellous, truly marvellous. Studhart also stated that one of the problems is that Adecco is recruiting under difficult circumstances. If 60 to 80,000 applicants a year are considered difficult circumstances, I'd hate to see what the good general considers better circumstances. Equally, the drop in the average wait time may make it easier for Defence leadership at Senate hearings, but as I will say, it is bad for Australia. And we are also now actively seeking recruits from overseas because apparently, and despite having 64,000 Australian applicants in 2024, not enough young Australians are willing to serve. I will note that there has always been ADF members who have been transferred from overseas defence forces, and there are very good reasons for doing so. But this proposal is very, very different. What do I mean by focusing on the average wait time is bad for Australia? Let's look at what makes the drop in the wait time so alarming. As I've said, the blowout in wait times was caused by the dramatic increase in applications during COVID. Equally, as the number of applications declines to a more natural level, the wait time will steadily reduce if Adecco does nothing different and puts no new staff into play. The average wait time will eventually reach the old standards, and those standards were almost completely dependent on the number of successful applicants and how long they were and are willing to wait. In order to have so dramatically reduced the average wait time, we would have had to either have seen 100,000 applications either withdrawn or rejected, and mostly those from the last year. In theory, you can reduce the average wait time by speeding up processing. So, in theory, the solution for Adecco is getting an applicant past the medical, aptitude and security checks, but most importantly, be actually part of an intake as quickly as possible. To make it easier, I'll just call them gates. The historical data prior to this year shows 2 things. Firstly, the bulk of the completed applications are neither part of an intake nor rejected applications, but are actually withdrawn by applicants who have simply given up. The second thing we know is that young Australians, contrary to the opinions expressed by Defence, are actually incredibly committed to joining the ADF. Over the last 5 years, the overwhelming majority had to put their life on hold and wait the better part of a year, with many taking even longer than that simply to join an ADF intake. That's commitment. However, that also means that many applicants are going to wait as long as they possibly can in order to get an intake slot. There is absolutely no reason that applicants last year would suddenly be less willing to wait than applicants from earlier years. Bluntly, to get the wait time down to 250 days without any significant increase in the intake should actually set off alarm bells. So how long does the processing actually take? This is the maximum number of days it would take to process 6,000 recruits. The first column is based around 350 days resulting from the COVID recruitment surge. The 300 days is prior to this surge. The 250-day column is what's now being achieved, and the final column is the target of 100 days. As you can see, it's quite a dramatic drop in theoretical processing time, but there's a catch. Even at 100 days, it's absolutely absurd to think of this 600,000 days as processing time. Obviously, the bulk is not spent actually passing a gate, but an applicant sitting by the phone waiting for the next appointment for clearance. Rather than processing, most of this time is, if you like, hurry up and wait. No matter what ADECO does, no matter how much you reduce the processing time, each applicant must still pass all the gates. And the most important gate, the one that ADECO has no control over, is waiting for an intake slot. Now, so the dilemma for ADECO is that complete lack of control. Now, normally, if wait time wasn't such a specific target, you would process all your applications, working through the gates, and then rejecting applicants who failed at one. Then, in time for the intakes, you would work your way down the list of applicants who have made it through the vetting processes to offer them a slot. You can categorize them by the strength of their application, but all being equal, you should start with the oldest. After contact, if they didn't wish to go ahead, you would mark their application withdrawn and go to the next on the list. In this way, you cull the applicants starting oldest first, but without disadvantaging any suitable applicant. Note that I have no idea if this was a process followed by Manpower, either in full or part, but given the blowout, it seems likely. If you had the resources, you would be in regular contact to see if an applicant still wanted to proceed. However, unless you're pressuring them to withdraw their application, the recruiter still has no control over how long an applicant is willing to wait. There are clearly two problems with this model. Obviously, no matter what you do, the average wait time will blow out to represent the number of suitable applicants vying for recruitment slots or intake slots. This is exactly what happened during COVID. The second is that the longer an applicant takes to get an intake slot, then they are increasingly likely to withdraw due to changes in employment or even personal relationships. It's a vicious circle. However, and this is very important from what I'll discuss later, a withdrawn applicant still leaves a potential recruit. The desire is still there, and once again, they may reapply if there are more changes in their work or personal life. The question is, how do you entice them back? Now, right now, at this time, the target intake for the entire ADF is a little over 10,000. Now, before I go on, a couple of notes. The available data is almost non-existent. We don't know the ratio between successful, withdrawn, or rejected applications. We can surmise, but we haven't got the hard data. Nor is the average time for each category available. So how long does it take to be rejected on average? How long does the average withdrawal take? The next point is that the ADF determines the numbers and the date for any intake. I keep hammering this because it's so important for what's coming on. If there are more applicants than intake slots, any excess successful applicants will be held over until the next intake. Therefore, successful applications increases the average wait time. Rejected applications must happen fairly early in the process. Therefore, this component will drag down the average wait time. Now, withdrawals are interesting. We know that many successful applicants will wait an extraordinary length of time in order to complete their enlistment. Up until now, this is probably the largest component of the average wait time. While some may withdraw early, the evidence is that if an applicant is found suitable, they will tend to wait quite some time. In terms of that 100 days average wait time target, if you're approved within 10 days, waiting another 90 days to find out if you can get the career you want is not that long a time. Therefore, This category will drag up the average wait time. You have to ask who is responsible for these three components, because that highlights the problem with a fixed target. Firstly, the recruiter has no control over the intake, neither numbers nor dates. The recruiter also has no control over when an application is withdrawn. But the recruiter is responsible for how many applications are approved in any period. What is clear is that an applicant that has passed all the gates and is just waiting on an intake slot will not withdraw for some time. Therefore, if too many applications succeed, then the average wait time will increase, which means that the only thing that the recruiter can control in this situation is the number of applications it rejects. If the number of successful applicants is blowing out the average wait time, then the only way the recruiter can bring it down is through rejecting new applicants at a much higher rate, and the earlier, the better. If this was a public service, it simply wouldn't matter. The timeline for recruitment to any position begins with the advertisement and ends with the final decision. If you didn't get the job, you may go on a merit list, but how long you are on that list has no impact on the time taken to fill the original position. Therefore, it is relatively easy to calculate the average length of time recruitment takes in the APS. So applying a specific target to a rolling intake such as the ADF is a mistake. The recruiter must focus on maintaining the average wait time at a specific target, which, as I've said, means the prompt use of rejections. What's fascinating is that the need to reject an applicant can actually become more important than their suitability simply due to variations in the actual number of applications. This one needs a little bit more explanation. Now, thanks to Stoddart, the specific details of Adecco's contract remains hidden, but we do know what their performance targets are for the average wait time. So let's start with what we know. Adecco is supposed to recruit a minimum of 6,000 suitable applicants to an upper maximum of 10,000 each year out of approximately 64,000. That's about 15%, and this is actually quite low. Now, let's say that amongst successful applicants, about 50% are withdrawn before they get an intake slot. This then creates the actual recruitment target of between 9 and 15,000. At 25%, 15,000 is still well below the US rate for successful applications. But what if you get an extra 2,000 recruits, either because too many applicants are successful or not enough withdraw? Because you have no control over the intake, your wait time immediately starts to blow out. The only way you can avoid any compounding effect is by ensuring you never find more than 15,000 suitable applicants every year, and it's actually probably less than that. The target for an average wait time actually creates a second quota. The two quotas are the minimum set by the ADF intake request and the maximum set by the need to maintain the average wait time. To manage both, the only tool available to the recruiter is to vary the number of rejections. And these quotas are applicable to any year, regardless of the number of applications. As an example, these are the combined rejection rates based on different numbers of applications from the high of 80,000 during COVID, 64,000 last year, and hopefully would be a worst case of 40,000. So you would need to reject anywhere from the 62% minimum up to an incredible 4 out of 5 applications. It goes without saying that the maximum ADF intake determines how many will eventually be recruited. So if there is an unusually large number of applications, a much higher number must be quickly cleared from the system, or the average wait time will blow out and the recruiter will miss their KPIs and therefore any financial reward from reaching those KPIs. It misses the point, and this is very, very important to understand. It is not that all applicants will make it into the ADF. It is how they actually miss out. Under the old model, most successful applicants who weren't offered an intake slot would end their application by withdrawing. Under the new system, the weighting moves towards rejecting excess applications. It's impossible to tell for sure as the numbers are kept seriously hidden, but every rejected application is an Australian lost to the ADF for good. A withdrawn application is not. Now, Adecco is very good at what it does. There is, after all, a reason why they are one of the world's leading recruitment agencies. But I don't think they've ever had a client like the ADF. As I've stated, Defence appears to have contracted Adecco to employ a brutal method of getting the average wait time down, and get it down quite dramatically. And that is by culling applications. How they do so is the issue. It is possible, based on media reports, that Adecco is using an AI, or more properly, an algorithm to process our applications. If so, passing the algorithm has become the most important gate. If you fit the parameters of the algorithm, you're through. If not, you're rejected even before you get to an interview. In which case, Defence is getting it wrong yet again. We have already seen it happen in 2024. We know applicants have waited a year before getting into an intake. So in the last 2 years, Adecco would have had approximately 130,000 applications, some of which were already approved and just waiting for a slot. Yet they fell short by over 3,000 recruits, but at the same time, the average wait time dropped by over 100 days. It's an extraordinary achievement to both miss your recruitment target and also reduce the average wait time by 30%. As I've said, the average wait time should have been steadily going down, but this is far too big an increase to be justified by the numbers. And that's where Soddart's gobbledygook comes into play. He simply avoided giving any explanation to Senate estimates as to how Adecco managed to reduce the average wait time. We don't understand the culling process. We don't know, for instance, if Adecco receives more money for getting the average wait time down or for successfully concluding an application through to the intake stage. We know that Adecco had more than enough applicants, but did they simply stuff up the number of successful applications that they had to process to both meet the target while not blowing out the wait time? What we do know is that there is a large number of claims that are rejected for really frivolous reasons, such as seeing a school counsellor or having childhood asthma. These are the types of refusal triggers that AIs are great at, but once an applicant is rejected, almost none will come back. And that is the real issue that in my own laborious way I was working my way to. At the beginning, I noted that the Army's failure to manage its intake is hurting the strategy of denial implemented under the DSR. I also noted that the number of applicants were actually sufficient for implementing both the DSR and the strategy of attrition. I'm going to end with discussing the impact of the ADF's recruitment system on strategic reliance, as well as on the willingness of Australians to serve. There are lots of terms floating around that can mean lots of different things. One is strategic resilience. It can be applied quite specifically, such as all reserves, or more generally, such as economic resilience. I'm going to look at strategic resilience in terms of around Australia's ability to mobilise our population in times of war. There are several factors limiting the size and speed of mobilisation for Australia. They are total eligible population, which earlier I noted that is just over 500,000 17 to 24-year-olds. This is then split into those willing to volunteer or will only serve if conscripted. But more importantly, there is the actual number of Australians with military experience. There is obviously the full-time members of the ADF, currently about 58,000, and total members in the reserves, which is about 41,000. Note I am using the full count for the reserves, despite repeated concerns over the actual number of active reservists. And finally, there are former ADF members who, of course, have military experience. That's about 73,000 under the age of 44, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. However, as roughly half of separations are involuntary, that would suggest the available number is closer to 30,000. Combined, this gives a potential strength of just under 100,000 initially, with a small pool who would need training periods to become effective. This would mean the ADF maxing out at around 130,000 in a crisis. The ANO has provided much better analysis of the reserves than Defence has ever made public, and it didn't look good. Equally, many of those who were former ADF members are simply incapable of returning to service, so the actual number is probably closer to 100,000, but it's a bit hard to say. Now, early in the presentation, I looked at the total numbers available for service. So, in addition to those Australians with military experience, you'd be looking at a pool of about 400,000 in the 17 to 24-year-old group willing to serve. And that's highly dependent upon a relaxation in recruiting standards. To that, you can add volunteers from a much larger pool of 25 to 39-year-olds. This estimate here uses the same ratio as that for the data on the lower age group. So you'd be looking at a potential volunteer pool of upwards of 1.5 million. But they would lack the weaponry needed for modern warfare, or a robust industrial system that could keep them supplied with ammunition, drones and stores that are required for modern combat. But even that doesn't matter. In reality, even if you could arm them, not one of these volunteers could help in any way. Unlike the recalled former ADF members, these volunteers would lack basic military training and would have to have an extended period of training if for no other reason than to just stop them being slaughtered. Importantly, the Navy and Air Force would benefit little from any general mobilisation just because they can't increase the number of aircraft or ships in any reasonable time frame. Equally, about half of all former members will actually belong to these two branches, so they have an existing experience pool more than enough to meet the Air Force and Navy's needs for some time. So, the Army is the obvious beneficiary of Australians volunteering in a crisis, as they had done so in earlier wars. The problem is that we would have to turn them away. Just as it has been for the last 5 years, we simply can't give them the training they need. In other words, no matter how willing they are, such volunteers are completely irrelevant in any military crisis for Australia, simply because of the choke point that is the Army's intake capacity. Now, both in my book and earlier presentation, I discussed how this can be reversed, but no matter. Historically, as Europe has shown repeatedly, both now in the face of Putin and previously for Germany, especially during the Cold War, the rate of expansion of the armed forces is a factor of its starting strength, especially so for an army. It took the German army 30 years to become the dominant force in NATO, and will take well over a decade from now to even get back to a fraction of that strength. The reality is that the smaller the army, the smaller your ability to train and intake, and any growth in training infrastructure is equally small. Now, as I said earlier, most volunteers will go into the Army who, based on their intake capability over the last 15 years, maxes out at an average of roughly 400 per month. This is the blue column in this chart. How quickly it can increase that intake is open to question, though of course it is far more complicated than what follows. Even if it doubles the intake every 3 months, then at the end of the year it will be training just 6,400 per month. My personal belief is that Australia, given the current state of defence, would find it difficult to even achieve a small fraction of this increase. Equally, in the first year, almost all this training will be for recalled former ADF members. Even if they just get an average of 3 months training, it will still take nearly a year to train the estimated 15,000 recalled Army members back up to standard. This is why you can completely ignore conscription. There is simply no point if you can't train willing volunteers. So, in a military crisis, out of a population of around 27 million, less than half of 1% are available for well over a year. Now, in this example, I've also included two alternate intake lines. The first alternate in red is based on maintaining the professional army or training a reserve army brigade every year. That gives a monthly intake of about 730. Using the same growth rate, then after a year, we could theoretically be training 11,000 per month. Increasing that starting point to that required for a reserve army of one division being trained per year, or about 20,000, now gives you a starting intake of 2,130 per month. It then rises to a theoretical 34,000 per month, though it would obviously be much lower. Again, I think all three overstate how quickly we can expand the training infrastructure, but it's obvious that the bigger the starting base, the faster the growth in actual numbers. Of course, this is completely irrelevant because we can't arm them. How realistic are these figures? Well, historically, they are far too high, and that's a serious concern for how quickly the ADF can expand in a crisis. A simple example is the expansion of the US Army in the Second World War, because it is somewhat unique and actually fits into Australia's current situation. The US Army, prior to the German invasion of Holland in late 1939, was very, very small in great power terms, reliant upon volunteers, and its intake was largely based on very limited expansion. Using Australian numbers, they would have needed an intake of all of about 1,500 per month. However, rather than sitting on their backsides, the Yanks used the 2-year warning period to dramatically expand their intake ability. These are the figures, though care should be taken. The actual intake would have been lower at the beginning of the year and higher at the end. Yet the problem is obvious. Although conscription dramatically increased the Army intake in 1941, it was obviously still small compared to subsequent years. In the year after Pearl Harbor, the average monthly intake grew by less than 50%, because it was limited by the size of the training facilities and trained NCOs. To obtain the same result after a year would see the Australian Army with a monthly intake of around 800, and only then would we see additional training facilities and qualified NCOs become available. It's the old concept, but reality is that in time of peace, you need to prepare the resources needed to increase the Army, and any expansion once war breaks out is limited by those facilities. Please note that I understand the criticism that I am Army-centric in this presentation, but the reality is that the Army is now, largely driven by policy, the only branch that can achieve rapid and relative cheap expansion either in peace or in war. Now, I am nearing the end, but I do want to discuss what I believe is a true crisis for the willingness of young Australians to serve. On current numbers, it will take less than 15 years for the ADF to reach 1 million applicants, and that's astonishing. That's 1 million applications before we get our first AUKUS submarine. In the same period, the target intake for the ADF is only around 150,000. So the crisis I am looking at is all to do with these unsuccessful recruits. There are two factors within this recruitment crisis. We are rejecting far too many, and note Defence also keeps the numbers very close to its chest about actually how many are being rejected. However, estimates of the number of applicants ineligible under minor selection-based criteria is from 1/4 to 1/2. In other words, at least 250,000 young Australians will, by 2040, be told by the ADF to go away. We just don't want you. As I've said before, essentially, a rejected application is forever a lost recruit. Under the old recruitment system, at least 250,000 applicants will either withdraw before their application was processed, or will withdraw after they are found eligible due to the time taken for processing. Many will withdraw due to changes in their circumstances, so in theory, they may at least consider applying should their circumstances change once more. There is another 350,000 Australians that fit into either of those two categories under the old recruitment system run by Manpower. I believe it is not unreasonable to think the bulk will go into the withdrawn applications category, and so they could also reapply. However, under the new recruitment system, it's quite probable that the bulk will have to be included in the go away, don't bother us category, simply because of the management needed to reduce the average waiting time. Now, again, we can't be sure because of responses like Stoddart's to Senate estimates. But as I've discussed, a system designed to cull applications to reach a maximum target dramatically decreases the number of applicants who will even have the opportunity to withdraw. Based on the numbers I've used in early examples, the cohort of successful applicants who withdraw prior to enlistment will drop from a maximum of about 750,000 to about 70,000, and that's best case. That means there will be about 500,000 applicants by 2040 who will either be culled because of selection-based criteria or for reasons primarily driven by the need to keep the average wait time down. What we don't know is under what category they will be culled and therefore what they will be told. It's quite probable that no matter the reason given for their failed application, they will never consider applying again, no matter what advertising campaign the ADF runs. It's really quite extraordinary how Defence has managed recruitment since 2019 and the astonishing problems they are creating for future recruitment. This is the problem with an insular defence establishment that has no flexibility and is focused on management rather than military needs. I am not debating whether the DSR strategy is correct or not, just pointing out the impact of these recruitment policies upon mobilisation. This is especially true given the current decline in the Army strength and the stagnation, if not continued reduction, of the pool of Australians with military experience. It's absolutely extraordinary to say that Australia, whose population will exceed 30 million by 2040, will still only have a total national pool of around 30,000 with military experience to support an ADF with a strength of about 120,000, but that's only including the reserves. The problem is, how do we break the ADF attitude towards recruits, which sees them as a management problem, and instead force them to look at how we best make use of about 60,000 Australians who every year put up their hands to serve. They are a fantastic resource that we are literally throwing away. One way is cost savings. If we simply reduce the cost of the average member of the ADF to the level of the UK's, we could theoretically increase the number of Australians in the ADF by 30,000, which is an incredible amount. Of course, to do so, both the ADF and the Defence Department would need massive reform, so it's not going to happen. In comparison, under the attrition strategy, many of the issues around recruitment are actually overcome. There is a clear separation between the regular and reserve armies, and there is a massive increase in the number of Australians with military experience. The option of joining the reserve army and only having to commit for a year's service is probably more attractive for many, and that would reduce the number of withdrawn applications, but we don't know because nobody has bothered to look. This is why there is no separate column for withdrawn applications in this chart that I've put up here. Even by just expanding the reserve army by a brigade plus supporting arms would mean that by the time that 1 million Australians will have applied for the ADF, an additional 60,000 Australians will have military experience. It's still not enough. Expanding it by a division per year means that nearly half of all applicants would gain some form of military experience, and the main recruitment problem would be helping those who have difficulty meeting the eligibility requirements. The outcome would be an increase in the number of Australians with military service of about 300,000, and that's true strategic resilience. Perhaps just as importantly, the creation of a reserve army will require the development of an industrial base sufficient to build and maintain the equipment, ammunition including drones, and supply logistics to maintain a force in being, as the Germans did during the Cold War and as Israelis do now. In conclusion, the only real manpower issue for the ADF this decade has been the sustained drop in the Army intake, and it's overwhelmingly been in the Army's intake. That drop created a temporary so-called separation crisis. That drop also led to completely unsubstantiated claims that there was a recruitment crisis. Equally, it is quite possible that the drop in the Army's intake was because of financial pressure on the Army resulting from the massive acquisition projects, first for the Air Force and then for the Navy. Of course, it is just as likely that it came from the pure incompetence we now expect from defence. Although the intake is a real problem here, there is, anecdotally, some justification to the belief that there is a decline in the willingness of young Australians to serve. Over the last 3 or 4 decades, there has been a dramatic redistribution of wealth in this country that no political party has addressed, and it has had an impact upon the ADF. Younger Australians, under a barrage of anti-Western propaganda and living the reality of a lifetime of relative struggle compared to that of their parents, are asking, why should they serve? What are we asking them to lay down their lives to protect? This is not too dissimilar to what was happening to the generation who stood tall in 1939, but there is a difference. We are neither adequately responding to their concerns or rebutting the propaganda. In a funny way, engaging our youth about why they should serve helps Australia define what our country should be, but that debate has been missing entirely for at least this century. Equally, when Australia was largely a middle-class society, we had a fairly homogenous group of men and women separated by rank in our defence forces. Now we have an ADF that is seriously split by class. Although you have to be careful not to take this argument too far, it is pretty clear that much of the retention benefits, including growth in star-ranked officers, favours class. Now, at the beginning I said this presentation would make you angry, but its end fills me with sadness. The failure to find a way for so many young Australians to serve, not just for the strategic benefit of having a larger group of Australians with military service, but for their own personal development, is a national disgrace. So here are my recommendations. No bonus 1 and 2, a winding down of the Home Owner Assistance Scheme. This should release upwards of $500 million per year for the following recommendations. Instead, we should be looking at recruitment bonuses, acknowledging that wait time is an example of how many Australians are willing to join but face difficulties due to limited intake. Sign up cash bonuses for those without a university degree upon successfully completing initial training. Sign up bonuses for those with a university degree, either in cash or their choice of taking all or part as credit towards a HECS debt. Obviously this component would be tax-free. Retention bonuses. Yes, I know what I said, but retention bonuses. Yearly retention bonuses for measurable results, as, for example, gaining promotion or completion of training courses. The rental assistance is commuted to pay for home ownership, and that ceases on exit. Finally, the wait time between some ranks is far too long, and often at the wrong time. As an example, the 7-year itch kicks in when many of the more career-minded and committed soldiers have reached or are close to reaching their 3rd increment. Therefore, they have no possibility of any real wage rise until promotion to sergeant, and that would be at least 3 years away. When ranks in any service go into a holding pattern like this, then there should be an equivalent increase in increments to match the average time taken to gain a promotion. This recommendation is about addressing the number of withdrawals amongst applicants, that is, the young Australians who have applied to join the Australian Defence Force. As I've noted, we are asking Australians to put their lives on hold waiting for an intake slot. Too many find a job that leads them down a different career path. This option gives them limited training, some pay, and a promise of preferential treatment for recruitment slots. In other words, if they're interested, keep them interested and try and get them in. Moving on, one major problem with retention, to my mind, is a lack of life experience many recruits bring to the ADF. Quite a few enlisted when they were far too young to understand the difference between the lifestyles in and out of uniform. For all its faults, there are some tremendous benefits to being in the ADF, such as sporting opportunity, often during the workday, mateship, and even travel. These benefits are not as readily available in civilian life. Quite frankly, the pay and general benefits are not too bad either. Rather than lose ADF personnel completely, here is my recommendation, partly drawn from my book. If a member of the ADF is considered leaving, rather than making a complete break, offer them a fixed term of 3 years equally split into both civilian and service periods of, as an example, 3 or 6 months each. The civilian side must be in areas that benefit at least some ADF skill sets. Examples include the excellent Protective Services Officer branch of the AFP. This is the branch that guards embassies, senior politicians and officials, and several major sites such as Pine Gap. They are also supposed to be the counter-terrorism first responders at the airports, although the AFP was trying to pass this over to the ABF as a cost saving. Another possibility is, of course, the police, mainly federal, but also state. We should consider additional incentives for serving in the north, such as land grants, and this 3-year split could include the development of their properties. I have no idea if that's possible, just putting it out there. Please note that the income for each period is that of the role they have taken, either in the ADF or, as an example, at the wages of the PSO. The idea is not to lose good people, but let them see what it's like outside the ADF. Shift work, significantly less sporting and physical opportunities, and a very, very different social world. If at the end they don't want to stay in the ADF full time, or not take an option like this, then they are probably no longer a good fit for the ADF itself. That's briefly my recommendations to fix a very, very broken system. This is a few reading recommendations. They're only going to reflect these presentations or my books, so it's not going to be general reading. The first is The Implications of Emerging Changes in Land Warfare for the Focused All-Domain Defence Force. It's quite a title. It's by Major General Chris Smith. It is interesting in its own right, but he also discusses the importance of the strength of the Army as a deterrent. Anyhow, it's free, so you have a read and make your own conclusions. Then there is No Higher Priority. In the lead up to the 2025 federal election, the guys at Strategic Analysts Australia, in conjunction with the IPA, brought out a 6-part recommendation on defence for any incoming government. A simple comparison would be the DSR's the strategy of denial light, while this book describes a strategy of denial heavy. As always, it's a little bit more complicated. The book costs around $40, but for a limited time, the individual parts are still available for download, absolutely free. Check out the SAA website. Now, civil defence plays a very big role in my book, but as a time saver, I've generally left it out from these presentations. I've included ASPI's report on Cyclone Tracy, not because it's good, it's certainly well written, but because it's dominated by the bureaucratic nonsense used to avoid making hard decisions or recommendations. The Australian whole-of-government flippancy towards civil defence, both in a crisis and in a time of war, is absolutely staggering. Happy to hear your thoughts. Please note I've included all these links in the description.